Empezamos ya la recta final de Barcelona Fashion Summit 2025. Para empezar la tarde vamos a hablar sobre si la moda es cosa de hombres, con diversidad, inclusión y nuevos cánones en la industria de la moda. Vamos a intentar desmontar o no, ahora nos lo dirá Jonathan, uno de esos tópicos que también hay sobre el sector. Tenemos con nosotros a Jonathan Hall, que es socio gestor especializado en prácticas de transformación sostenible en Kantar desde febrero de 2020. Entró en la compañía de datos en julio de 2005, desarrollando diversos roles y responsabilidades basado en Londres, París, San Francisco o Nueva York. Actualmente ejerce como director no ejecutivo en la organización sin ánimo de lucro Water Unite y en la asociación Market Research Society. Thank you, Jonathan, for being with us today.
Hello, everyone. Well, I have the responsibility of keeping you awake after lunch, so I'll try my very best. So what I want to talk to you about today is diversity, inclusion, and the new canons in the fashion industry. And I'm going to have 4 sections to talk this through. First of all, I want to talk about the disruption that we're all living through and have lived through over the past 15 or so years, and the opportunity that comes with that. Then I'll move on to talk about the challenges, the problems that also accompany the opportunity that we see before us. And then I want to talk about how we as an industry, the fashion industry, can really start to create meaning with our customers through 2 ways. First of all, responsibility, and second, through inclusivity. So let's talk about disruption. So at Kantar, we talk about how we're living in the era of disruption. And what we see on the left-hand side of this chart behind me is the Global Economic Policy Uncertainty Index. And what you see is a relatively smooth line between 1997 and 2008. Actually, that smooth line really started in the 1980s. And the period from then up to 2008, the global financial crisis, is called by economists the Great Moderation. Now, that moderation is very much behind us now, since 2008. And you start to see how we got turbulence after the financial crisis. I've stopped the data there at 2021. You can imagine how that would continue to be disruptive. And certainly, since the 20th of January, since the inauguration of the new US president, you could expect a lot of turbulence there as well. Now, this is important because all of the business processes, the planning, the management techniques that we've used in business today were all conceived in the period of moderation. But we're entering a period now where turbulence is the norm. That will be our jobs, to deal with turbulence and disruption. And so we're going to have to adapt those tools and processes. And this is only going to get more turbulent because, as you see, on this side of the chart, this is the World Economic Forum Global Risks Report, which they produce every year. And that looks at the relative severity of risks over a 2- and a 10-year period. And what you see, of course, is that climate change and associated risks are the things which actually dominate the agenda. Now, this is important for businesses because it increases pressure from various stakeholders. So today we've been talking about the pressure from governments, regulation, particularly in the EU. The global economy now is 91% legally committed to the net zero transition. If you think about employees, so people in this room, if we think about millennials and Gen Z in particular, between 75 and 85% anywhere across the world want to work for organizations that align with their values on sustainability. And then if we think about financial services, insurance businesses, investment companies, they're looking at the risk profile of our companies and trying to understand where we stand because they're worried about where to invest their money. But I'm here to talk about consumers. And this is Kantar data from last year, 35 countries across the world, 74% of people saying, look, I believe businesses have responsibility to make society fairer. And 2/3 of people saying it's businesses' responsibility to solve climate and environmental issues. This is particularly true of younger cohorts. I'm going to talk a lot about generations over the next 20 minutes or so. So this is a different data set, but two questions. One is, I consider myself an environmentalist. The other is, buying sustainable products or choosing environmental and socially conscious services shows others who I am and what I believe in. So a strong sense of self-identity and how I project my identity there. And in both cases, you'll see two generations higher than the others. First of all, millennials, and second, Gen Z. Now, if you broke out those millennials into older and younger, you would have younger millennials who are actually the ones who are driving the value shift in society. So they would be much higher. And Gen Z over time are being pulled along. And this is really important. So please just remember that, because I'll come back to it. Mark Carney, who's the former governor of the Bank of England, the Bank of Canada, now the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, running for the presidency in Canada right now, his conclusion is, look, if some companies and entire industries fail to adjust to this new world impacted by climate change, they will fail to exist. No surprise then that in the annual CEO survey by the United Nations Global Compact and Accenture, that essentially 100% of CEOs said that sustainability is critical to their company's future success. Now that's about risk and the danger that's inherent, but there's also huge opportunity. In McKinsey's analysis of the economic opportunity of the sustainable transition, they reckon that there's $12 trillion of opportunity on a year-by-year basis. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development arrived at the same number through a different methodology. So we're talking huge numbers here. This is Kantar data from our Brand Z database, which is the world's biggest brand valuation database. And what you see behind me on the left-hand side is the contribution to the value of the world's top 100 brands of sustainability. And that is $193 billion. That sounds pretty big, but it's worth bearing in mind that only 2 of those brands are actually overperforming on sustainability. If the other 98 did better, then we'd see an even greater contribution of sustainability, and we will see that in the future. If you look at the third column, this is a number about corporate reputation. So this is, for about the last 4 or 5 years, sustainability has been the main driver of corporate reputation. Now, it constitutes 45% of the corporate reputation value of the top 100 brands. And the EU fashion industry is, when we look at it from a compliance perspective, we're doing a great job. So over the last 6 years, and this is Eurostat data, the industry has managed to decouple, this magic word, managed to decouple economic growth from emissions. So what we're looking at here is the evolution of carbon dioxide emissions intensity. And that on an annual basis has been dropping by 9.7%. So some great progress. Now, we've outlined a massive economic opportunity. The industry is doing well, but there's a problem. In fact, there are 3 problems. So this is data from our work with the World Federation of Advertisers. This is not amongst consumers, it's amongst the world's leading marketers across the world. 90% of marketers saying sustainability agendas need to be more ambitious. Similar number saying that we need to get braver and experiment to drive transformative change. And on the left-hand side of the chart, this is their analysis of how well advanced their businesses are. The green line is their organization, so that's at 15% are well advanced, and the marketing function is at 10%. And one of the reasons they feel this is because there is still a consumer value action gap. Now, this is something we met as speakers last night, we were talking about. I'm sure you'll have been experiencing this every day if you're thinking about how do you monetize sustainability with your consumers. Because don't people just say, well, yeah, sustainability is important to me, but actually they don't buy the things. This is what the value action gap is all about. And it's been something which has been in academic literature for 20 years. This is our data from last year, 93% of people across the world saying they want to live a more sustainable lifestyle, but only 10% actually following through. And I hear a lot of clients say to me, well, you know, people overclaim and they're virtue signaling. And sure, some of that's true. But there are some very real barriers that consumers experience that brands could help them with, and I'll come back to that. So one of the things that we do at Kantar is we do an analysis of the consumer perceptions of sustainability by individual sectors. So 42 sectors across the world. This index here is plus 100 to a minus 100. What you see plus 100, this side, is fruits and vegetables, electric vehicles, meat alternatives, dairy alternatives. So the sort of things you'd expect. At the bottom there are tobacco and vaping. So how is the fashion industry doing? Well, really not very well. So actually in the bottom tier. And if you're in the luxury industry, you're doing even worse. It's only tobacco and vaping that are doing worse than you. So this is a second problem. First of all, we have the value action gap. And second, we have a sector which is very poorly perceived by consumers. It gets worse, I'm afraid. So greenwashing. There's a staggering statistic here, which is 52% of people across the world say they have seen or heard false or misleading information about sustainable actions taken by brands. So that's across every sector. Even worse for fashion, third worst sector, and luxury slightly behind it. And the story does in fact get worse. This is a very complicated chart, so forgive me, but quite an important one. So what you see on the left-hand side here, we have a horizontal axis of greenwashing perceptions, and the vertical axis is people who are seeking out ways to reduce their impact. And we see an almost perfect correlation. So what that means is that the more people are actually investigating solutions to help them be more sustainable, the more they perceive that brands are lying. On the right-hand side, what we see, again, same horizontal axis. The vertical axis is those people who've stopped buying certain products and brands because of what they found out. And again, what we see is an almost perfect correlation. So the takeout from this chart is the more people look for solutions, sustainability solutions, the more they believe brands are just lying, they're just greenwashing. And so, of course, what they do is they stop buying those brands and products. And this is a massive erosion of trust that is really something quite new in society and in brand management. So, three problems there. First of all, we're not really helping consumers close that gap between their values and their actions. We've got a very poorly perceived sector, and actually, people think we're greenwashing. So how do we change this? How do we create meaning and connection with our customers and consumers? I'm going to talk about two ways. First is responsibility, and second is inclusivity. And I'm going to start with some great news, which is 88% of people actually want brands to help them live more sustainable lifestyles. So they're not saying, okay, I think they're greenwashing, but I don't want anything to do with these brands anymore. It's an open invitation. If brands can help them be who they want to be and align their values and their behaviors, fantastic. They will start to buy your brands. Now, I mentioned the study that we do every year on looking at different sectors and consumers' perceptions of sectors. Now, why this is important is because when a consumer is thinking about you as a brand, the first thing they'll think about is which sector does that brand operate in? So if you're a fashion brand, or if you're a bank, or if you're a consumer tech business or alcohol, those issues that they perceive you to have authenticity and credibility on will be different, right? Of course, that's intuitively correct. I'd hope you'd agree. And what you can also do is you can analyze, something, a pretty nice piece of analysis here. So what we see is the relevance by sector, which is what I've just been talking about, of various sustainability issues. And on the vertical axis is, of course, the importance of that concern. So what you have then is you have bottom right, so we're only interested in the issues that are relevant to our sector. So the bottom right would be things which they're very relevant to our sector. The concerns are reasonably important. So these are things which we call shields or defensive plays. Top right are those things which are offensive plays. So where the concern is very important to consumers and actually very relevant to our sector. So let's look at fashion specifically. This is global data, about 35 countries across the world. And what we see is, so these are the defensive plays. These are the things which are really relevant to our sector and are, reasonably important. And we get 3 buckets. So don't look at that, look at this. We've got issues around waste. So overconsumption and production, overpackaging, things going to landfill, even toxic waste. So that's one bucket. Second is around ethical business practices. You can see there, and respective rights at work. And the third is around carbon footprint. So those are 3 buckets that we can be thinking about. And then what we've got are those things which are really important to people and really important to the sector. And those fall into a couple of buckets. So it's less about waste now, it's more about pollution. So it's about water, it's about air, and it's about plastics and microplastics. And then we've got a shift from business ethics into equity and equality, so economic equality and poverty and living wage issues. So those are the 5 big buckets that fashion businesses should be thinking about. Now, this is really helpful because your businesses will have a whole series of ESG commitments. And if you're thinking, how do I actually monetize sustainability? Where should I focus amongst all of these issues? What this starts to do is it focuses where your consumers are most concerned and therefore where you can start to engage them. If you're a luxury brand, I won't go into the same sort of detail, but you can see that it exists. But I've just put boxes on the side of the chart there. So again, you might be able to guess this. These are issues around economic inequality, poverty. There's also a lot of suspicion of luxury brands in terms of corruption and tax evasion. We get similar sentiment with regard to big tech companies. And then, of course, you've got concerns around animal welfare. So those are the sorts of things that you'd want to be thinking about in terms of luxury. So if that's, I'm just going to go back. So if that's one way you can start to create meaning with consumers by really addressing the issues that are relevant in their minds to your sector, the second thing is helping them reduce those barriers that allow them to live the sustainable lifestyle they want to. So this is all based on behavioral science. I won't go into this today, but some of you will be familiar with this field in psychology. And what we see on this side of the chart here are those barriers or frictions that people as consumers feel that stop them in fashion from actually making the sustainable choices that they want to. And what we see are a series of barriers. So the first, you would have guessed it, right? It's too expensive. Now, even if that's not true, even if sustainable products and services aren't more expensive, in consumers' minds, they have that link. So that's something we need to overcome. The second is all about information and awareness. So the next 3 are all about that. Not enough information, impossible to find out what impact products have, and there are no suitable alternatives I know of. Then it's got stuff around, it's too much effort, it requires too much time. Then there are concerns around quality, performance of the experience. So what you start to see there is a picture of barriers that we can address as brands. If we can start to help people reduce these barriers, then we've got a chance to actually create meaning and connection with consumers. So that's the second way. First of all, think about the issues that they feel are important, and second, really help them with barriers. Now, there are many examples of brands. We could all give a lot. Here are some. Refashion in France, which the French government is incentivizing people to repair their products. Similar in Singapore with Recustom. Early Majority, a subscription-based model, gives reductions. You've got Petit Pli in France as well, so more stretchable kids' clothing to address the need to constantly reclothe children. Chloe Vertical with their 100% transparency, but also their instant retail onto Vestiaire Collective, and Bottega Veneta with their lifetime guarantee around repair. There are many, many other examples. Those are some of them. And then the final section I want to talk about now is inclusive growth. So inclusion is often a term that people think about as being very niche. And obviously nowadays as well, it's something which is also very politicized. So in defining what I mean by inclusion today, I want to talk about the economic value of inclusion. And I want to talk about the significant opportunities in high growth, underserved populations. These are some of them behind me. Unfortunately, I know many of the people in the audience today will empathize with this. Women represent a very significant underserved population in many sectors across the world, despite having control of $43 trillion of global consumer spending. Two others I'll pick out: the LGBTQ plus community. 371 million people across the world currently identify in that population. They have $3.9 trillion of buying power. People with disabilities, there are 1.3 billion around the world, and they control $8 trillion of buying power. These are not small numbers, right? So when we're thinking about inclusion, we should be thinking about big segments of consumers. I want to overlay generational theory on top of this because this is really important. So you remember my comment before about younger millennials pulling Gen Z through and the value set that they have and the impact on society that that's going to have. Now, when you look at the last 130 years, there's only been one previous pivot that's similar to the one that we're going through currently, and that was after the Second World War. So you'll all be familiar with this. It was led by the boomer generation, and it was a shift from institutionalism to individualism. And those brands which took advantage of that benefited hugely and flourished. So I'm thinking of brands like Harley-Davidson and Levi's and Marlboro, typically. Now, it didn't mean institutionalism went away completely, but individualism was the dominant value set in society. We are going through, it started already, it will continue, a similar value shift. And that is from individualism to mutualism. It's being led by those younger millennials. Obviously, individualism is not going to disappear. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of reactionary forces that we're seeing today in various parts of the world. But the trend lines are clear. And this is all the more important because there's going to be a huge intergenerational transfer of wealth over the next 20 years. So that wealth is going to go from boomers to millennials and Gen Z. And in the US alone, the value of that transfer is $85 trillion. And that's in the US alone. So when those millennials and Gen Zers get their hands on that money, they'll be able to start in the marketplace buying the things which align with their values. And who knows, they may start to pay the premium that we all want to pay in terms of sustainability. A bit more data about their values. So we're looking at two questions here. Diversity and inclusion is important to me. You'll see it jumps from boomers to Gen X. It jumps again from up to millennials and Gen Z. Similarly, it always or often influences my buying decisions. We see a similar sort of jump. Also, we heard today about how we've had disproportionate growth in emerging markets. Well, look at this. Inclusion is key for emerging majorities, with some demographics which are going to grow enormously over the next few years. Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, Brazil, India, Colombia, Mexico. These will all experience explosive demographic growth over the next years. These are the countries who are dominated by millennials and Gen Z and their value set, and these are the countries for whom inclusion is extremely important. Now, we also run a survey called the Brand Inclusion Index, 18 countries across the world, which measures consumer perceptions of brand performance on inclusion issues. Nike come top, Adidas second. We get some tech brands there, Amazon and Google coming in. And then you have Zara coming in at 13, Uniqlo at 16, H&M, and Benetton. Now, many of those brands are doing things for specific communities. Nike addresses different populations, so it's interesting going into the qualitative data to understand why Nike does so well. And it's important to understand this. They make people feel included. They have relevant products that meet unique needs, so it's not just about communications. They actually create new products for those underserved communities. They're felt to be pioneering. They stand up for underrepresented populations. And crucially, they're committed to diversity and inclusion, and they have been for a long time. So they don't just fly a pride flag in their store when it's that time of year, or put a pride flag on their product and then forget that population. They're committed to it over time. Compare that with this. This is an ad I pulled. So you get a family that's not diverse. You've got a mother who's clearly too young and hasn't just got out of bed, frankly. We have negative message on females' pajamas, positive messages on the male pajamas, and we have pajamas of expected color by gender. This just looks tone deaf in today's society. And what I want to just talk about now, as I come towards the end, is 3 types of inclusion, which brands are actually starting to deal with, and how it differs from this sort of execution. So the first is around size inclusive, next is going to be around gender neutrality, and third around culture positivity. So compare that last advertising with this from Universal Standard, and how that welcomes people of different needs. Similarly, you get a brand like Megère, and on the right-hand side there, you see a blogger saying, you know, having a completely separate section for plus-size clothing makes the women that need to shop in that section feel separated from everyone else. You don't know how many times I saw a group of friends walk in, and one girl, just because she was considered plus-size, had to separate from her friends and shop by herself. Doesn't sound great. Gender neutrality. So this is something you'll be familiar with. Obviously, brands like Unrecorded, Wildfang, and Korg, all doing things in this space, and then bigger brands like Stella McCartney. But you're also getting retail outlets. So this is the Fluid Project in Manhattan, which is, yes, an apparel store, but it's also a juice bar, and it's also a coffee shop, and it also holds events. And one of the influencers here saying, you know, I feel like I need my emotional support friends when I go shopping. Lord knows it already takes enough damn courage to try on a dress you think might be a little too small. I don't need to deal with gender courage on top of trying to figure out the self-esteem stuff that everyone experiences. And then finally, culture positive. So this is a more complex issue, and obviously something that brands across the world need to take into account. So 2 questions here from our US data. The first one on this side here. I feel a need to preserve my family's cultural traditions. Very high numbers there amongst different ethnic communities. And then Americans today are not sensitive enough to the concerns of racial, ethnic, religious, and social minorities. Again, you know, very significant numbers. And you see the anger that this sort of lack of sensitivity can really engender. So the Navajo Nation spokesman saying, we've gone through the atrocities to survive and ensure our way of life continues. Any mockery, whether it's Halloween, Victoria's Secret, they are spitting on us. So the sort of cultural appropriation that we see there from Valentino using cornrow hairstyles, we've got Victoria's Secret using a Navajo battle dress. And obviously this is not particularly sensitive. On the positive side, you get a brand like Osklen, where the creative director went into the Amazon, spoke to the tribe, gave them then a platform to talk about their aesthetics and what their concerns were, and then importantly gave them royalties from the collection. Adidas working with the artisans in Someone Somewhere to create new kits for the Mexican football team, and more prosaically, Nike working with Opium Paris for the designer's Moroccan origins there. And then I just want to highlight one last thing, which is the modest fashion industry and how that's on the rise. So we've seen examples of this. Interestingly, Muslim consumers are spending Their spending's gone up by 4.8% between 22 and 23, and is expected to reach $428 billion by 2027. But equally importantly is this quote here by Professor Lewis from the London College of Fashion. It's true that globally the biggest consumer segment for modest fashion is Muslim women, but women from other religious cultures also want modest clothing. And many women who are secular or not religious also want ensembles that allow them to choose which parts of their body are on display. So we're only going to see this grow. So does this deliver brand equity? Does it deliver sales value? So this is some work that we did with the Business School at Oxford University and the United Nations Stereotype Alliance. And it was using our communications evaluation database and our brand equity database. And what you see is that those brands that use inclusive advertising experience very significant uplift on both short and long-term brand and sales metrics. So a 33% higher strong consideration, 62% higher likelihood of being the first brand choice, an 8% higher incidence of trial, 23% lower chance of post-trial abandonment. And then if we're talking about premium pricing, 54% higher pricing power and 15% higher loyalty. And then concretely on sales, a 3% higher short-term sales uplift and a 16% higher long-term sales uplift. So pretty impressive, validated numbers there. So that's it. Thank you for bearing with me. I hope it kept you awake. And just to summarize, thank you, it's very kind. Just to summarize, there's a huge amount of disruption. We need to get used to it. I'm sure we are. But there's also massive economic opportunity. There are problems, the consumer value action gap, a poorly perceived sector, and greenwashing. But we can address those by creating meaning, informing commercial arrangements which speak to the issues which consumers really expect of us. Part of that is responsibility, and part of that is about inclusion. Thank you.